I was so angry watching it. Could have been stopped.
Yeah, it
Could have been
sucks to be
stopped.
right about something so bad.
The difference between peace and war is everything.
I don't think I've ever asked you this. Why Israel?
If you hate Israel, guaranteed you would really dislike America. The saving grace in America is some kind of belief in the goodness of the American people.
What do you think America should do?
Don't sit back and think it's going to be solved for you.
Douglas, I'm so glad to be with you here.
It's great to be with you.
It's funny that we meet in Montana, of all places, right?
Why not?
Well, it's so great. People ask me, why am I such a groupie of Douglas Murray? And so I'm going to tell you that I've been waiting to tell you this. But I think that what's amazing about you is that it's not only that you have the discernment to see what is going on and what it might lead to, but you have a way with words. You're so articulate that you kind of get to say that thing that all of us are thinking, but don't quite know how to explain it. And it's been very helpful, especially in an environment where, you know, things are pretty crazy right now, and discernment is hard and confusing in the era of the internet and the era of information coming at us from all kinds of directions, and finding the right words and finding a person who can help piece it all together is very, very helpful. So thank you for everything you've been doing. And some people have discovered you recently because of your newer book, The War on the West, and what you've been doing in Israel and fighting anti-Semitism. But we discovered you years ago many years ago. We've been long-term friends when you were warning the world about the strange death of Europe. And another one of those examples of how you have that ability to discern. And so I'm curious, I don't think I've ever asked you this, your background. It's just, what did you think you're going to do when you grew up?
Well, that's very kind. I mean, it's very hard for me to explain myself, as it were. You know, we're not transparent to ourselves. I think if I have an ability in the area you kindly describe, it's that I do try to say things that I think and I see. And sometimes I found that what I'm thinking and saying is what other people are thinking about but haven't said yet. So I suppose that's sort of one of my unofficial functions. How that came about, well, I know, of course, I grew up in the age before the internet, and that's a very important thing these days. I sometimes say that what we're living through at the moment is a second dark age. If the first dark age was characterized by ignorance caused by a lack of information, the second dark age, the one we're in, is ignorance caused by a surplus of information, just too much information. Too much is coming at us. And we human beings are very vulnerable, we're suggestible, much more. And I think that means that, you know, we live in this great confusion about what we should think, whether the things we see with our eyes are true, and the apps can tell us that we're wrong and our eyes deceive us. I was certainly brought up with a great emphasis on truth. I was brought up to a very Christian household, Church of England, and went to a Catholic school for a time, which I sometimes joke inoculated me to Catholicism, but I have a great respect for Catholics as well. I became very interested in books and ideas when I was pretty young. Was a rather unusual creature for those times at university, in that I actually read the newspapers and wanted to find out what was happening in the world. And that wasn't that common. And I wanted to get out into the world and see it. I certainly had a hunger for that from a very early age. I wrote my first book very early. It came out when I was in my second year at Oxford. And that was in 2000, so rather alarmingly a quarter of a century ago now. And yes, I suppose I knew I wanted to be out in the world and seeing. I also grew up with a great love of culture, particularly of music, but also of literature and philosophy. And I've sometimes thought that I really, in regards to politics, because politics it's not my first love, you know. I mean, I was never one of those people who just adored the fight of politics. In fact, I never did like it. I always kept away from party politics. But I did recognize that if you're going to keep the culture good, and by that really what I mean is keeping the culture safe for culture, for people to be able to create and express and much more, and to think and to solve problems and get somewhere. To do that, the politics had to be right, and you had to make sure that the political setup was such that it was safe for creativity, innovation, thought, freedom, and much more. So, yes, if I had a sort of underlying philosophy, it's probably that.
It's interesting you say that, because you say that politics will impact culture, but also culture impacts politics, right?
For sure.
It totally goes back and forth. So what did you study in college? And then did you start traveling the world?
Yes, I came to America first. I was born in Britain, as people can probably tell. And
the lovely accent, of course.
Well, I came to America first as a schoolboy researching my first book, and fell in love with America then. And partly that's the opportunity of America, and I loved the openness and the encouragement I found here, and always that inoculated me to some of the anti-Americanism which you can find in Britain and in Europe.
Really?
Mm-hmm. And yes, so I studied somewhat at university, but really I was already off as a writer, and that was the crucial thing for me. I was out in the world as a writer, and then starting to work in journalism and becoming a reporter as well. It was very important for me to see things with my own eyes. That was something I knew very early on I had to do. I had a kind of, not just, if you have a critical frame of mind, I think some people assume that you only have the critical frame of mind going outwards. And that isn't true. Certainly not true for me. The criticism also turns inwards. So I already had a contempt for people who wrote about things they didn't know about. But the flip side of that is I couldn't write about things I didn't know about. I couldn't write about a country that I hadn't been to. And by the way, be amazed how many people do write about countries they haven't been to and societies they don't understand or know. And so yes, I mean, and so it was a sort of an ambition, I suppose, just a necessity. I thought that I traveled, saw things as much as possible, and that's never left me, and I hope never will.
Are there things that you have seen around the world that you feel have left an everlasting impact on you?
Oh, for sure. There's so many things. I mean, countries at war and societies at war always leave a deep impact on you, in particular, probably the deepest, because because that's you discover you realize what's sort of obvious, but until you really see it, you don't know. The difference between peace and war is everything, absolutely everything. The fact that here in Montana today, there is no likelihood that a rocket will land near us. We don't have to fear that, an enemy army will break down this neighborhood. And that makes all the difference. What we're doing now is possible because the conditions have been set, because of the decisions that Americans have made and America has been able to benefit from, that we live in peace. But not all the world has had that advantage. And of course, everywhere you go where a society has fallen apart or is in the process of falling apart makes a huge impression. One of my first books was on the conflict in Northern Ireland, a book which did not sell very many copies, but which I was very proud of. And I grew up with that conflict and saw some of that. And that, I suppose, gave me a certain taste for recognizing this difference and what is it that makes a society fall apart, and how lucky we are not to live in such societies. But wherever you go where people are living in the realm of war, it always leaves an indelible impression. I mean, something I haven't talked about that much, but when I, some years ago, went to northern Nigeria to write about the plight of the Christian communities there, I saw things and heard stories that will always be with me. And it's extremely humbling to be, for instance, able to interview a bishop whose house has been repeatedly, attacked, whose wife had been raped, and who still led a congregation of great faith. You never forget those things.
I guess that's a part of how you develop discernment, right? You go and see in your own eyes what evil looks like or what war
Oh,
looks
yes.
like, right? So many people
Yes.
are sitting here in the United States judging or making very strong statements about war or peace, but they don't quite understand maybe what they're talking about because they haven't seen what human nature could do.
Well, that's a sort of fundamental misunderstanding that does exist in most Western societies about peace, which is that we flatter ourselves with an idea that I've never really been able to believe, which is that people are essentially just good. And that is just such a misunderstanding. We can be good, but we are this strange thing, humans. We have this great capacity for goodness and a terrible capacity for evil. And as many philosophers have pointed out, it runs not between one group and another, or one race and another, or one culture and another, but down the heart of everybody. But if you live in a society that's at peace and you've been brought up with that, it's likely that you will fall into this idea that, for instance, there's no such thing as bad people, just people who've been badly, I don't know, educated badly or not correctly, or they just haven't had the opportunities that they could have had, and so on. And actually, whenever you stare into the heart of that, I think it's impossible not to come back with the belief, and again, it's difficult not to talk about it in theological terms, but that there is such a thing as evil in the world, and that it exists. And a historian who I'm enormously fond of, the late Gita Sereni, spent a lot of her life studying the most evil people. And towards the end of her life, she said, in an interview, although she had no explanation for it theologically, she did believe that evil came down somehow. She spent her life thinking about it, interviewing, Nazi war criminals, a child killer, and others, and that it was a force somehow in the world. And if you don't at least contend with that, you haven't even started in your understanding of people.
Right. I mean, there's so much evil in humanity to believe that it's something that is only learned and not oftentimes innate.
Yes.
It's to really be blinded to the humankind.
Absolutely. I mean, some people can be taught into evil for sure, as they can be taught into good. But there are also wicked people in the world.
What made you write your more recent book, The War in the West?
Well, that was actually something I've been coming for a while. I wrote a book there, The Strange Death of Europe, that came out in 2017, which is really, it's not just about Europe. It's about the challenge of mass migration in the 21st century, which I've long thought is the challenge which no society is on top of, and no government really understands how much our societies are going to be roiled in the 21st century by the ease of movement and the ease with which the world now knows what they can get if they just move. And I don't blame anyone who does that, but so much of the world, so many societies are in disarray. I mean, just look at, Central America and South America, just to give one example. Look at the collapse of Venezuela in our own lifetimes. I don't blame anyone for leaving a society that's collapsed or wanting to leave a society that's collapsed, but I knew that developed societies, developed governments that really were not contending with this problem, even remotely. And I wrote that, and I was rather surprised because I thought it would completely destroy me, and I would not be allowed out into whatever remains of polite society ever again.
Well, I would imagine that, because you sound like, what would they call you, a xenophobe or just cruel, not allowing refugees to come and get a better home or a better chance? Is that what they were?
The book was quite significantly attacked, mainly by people who hadn't read it, which is something I'm used to. Yeah. But fortunately, it got a very wide readership and it became an international bestseller. And that was one of the times I realized I'd sort of put my finger on something that people were. The first time I saw somebody reading it on a London tube train, which was the day after publication, I thought, that's a good sign.
That's fun.
That's a good sign. Because as a writer, also you put ideas out. You're never quite sure, if they're going to land, if people are going to be interested. But I knew I'd put my finger on something there. I then wrote The Madness of Crowds about the crazy identity politics era we were going through. And I wrote that book partly because after finishing The Strange Death of Europe, I thought, wow, there are other great taboos in our society, why don't I find them all and jump all over them as well?
Right? You're like, you already took a few arrows. You might as well take the rest of them.
Somebody described a friend who was actually in the military in the UK said that he thought that my self-appointed task seemed to be to pogo jump across minefields. And but so anyway, when I finished the Madness of Crowds, I was aware that I'd put my finger on another set of things, but the thing that really, The War in the West, was a sort of culmination of those three books, because I realized that really one of the things that was going on is this crazy anti-Westernism in our time, the crazy way in which you can just, with 100% predictability, you'll know that a young American will look at any problem in the world and believe it's America's fault. And that if you're a young British person being miseducated in the school system there, or a young European, you will be being told that all of the problems of the world are due to colonialism or slavery or much more. And I'd noticed this for a long time, but I really wanted to dig down into why this had happened and who was pushing it. Mm. Because there are specific people who are pushing this. And part of it is an internal push. People inside Western societies who love pushing this misinterpretation of history.
Why? Why would you be a Westerner wanting to push that the West is the worst place on planet Earth?
Well, in some ways, I mean, it's of course narcissism, because it presumes that nothing in the world can go wrong unless we made it so. Mm. In other words, you can still be enormously self-absorbed and only interested in your own society, and yet present yourself as an internationalist,
right.
You know.
Right.
And that's just one of them. The other is just a simple miseducation. I mean, I'm horrified by the state of higher education in the US in particular, where people study degrees that are not disciplined and are just educated as such as they are into a sort of form of political activism. You know, the idea that the ultimate purpose of education should be to create little culture warriors.
Is it not the case in the UK?
Slightly less. In fact, quite a lot less, I'd say. Quite a lot less. And there's much less of the grievance studies, you know, where you go to a university in order to become, yes, a sort of little activist, where the ultimate purpose of being a student is to aspire to live in a tent and crap in a bag and say you're doing it for people in a continent you've never been to.
Right.
But yes, so I mean, some people do that. But of course, the other thing with the anti-Westernism, it is very, very useful for America and other Western countries, competitors, rivals, and also enemies, to push this. You know, it's enormously useful for communist China that there are so many people in America who wish to think the worst of America. It turns out, of course, you know, the Ayatollah Khomeini congratulated the students who have been protesting in recent months in America, congratulated them. It's very useful for the Ayatollah in Tehran that there should be a generation of Americans who have been brought up to believe that they should protest against America and America's allies.
Right. It's like, thank you very much for doing the job for me.
Yes. It's the famous quote attributed to Napoleon that, you know, if your enemy is making a mistake, don't interrupt them. Hmm. And that's one of the things that's going on. But I'm stunned by this movement, because I think it's demonstrably, as I try to show in the book, and I try to give people the arguments and the evidence to push back against this movement, it's stunning to me the extent to which this misrepresentation of our past has succeeded. Elon Musk said this a little while ago in an interview with Bill Maher, you know, said if your child comes home from school and knows about Thomas Jefferson, they will know that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves.
Of course. What
else did Thomas Jefferson do? Blank. That's very interesting. That happened in a lifetime. I actually spoke at Thomas Jefferson's University, the University of Virginia, last year, and I was rather amused that at the end of my remarks, the woman came over to me absolutely furious with me, because I had highlighted the fact that a lot of scholarship actually agrees with that Thomas Jefferson did not father children with one of his slaves. She was absolutely furious that I had put out there just what is an absolutely acceptable historical counterpoint. Went into the DNA evidence, which I can do, and she was furious. And I said, this is so interesting because a generation or two ago, if I'd stood at Thomas Jefferson University and said Thomas Jefferson was a rapist, people would have been furious. Now, you're furious that I said he wasn't a rapist,
Right.
or might not have been a rapist. It's absolute fury that that the founding father in question was not as bad as she hoped he was. That's the virus of our times.
Well, and I would add that the virus of our times is, look, I'm in love with studying history. I think studying history is so important. But the focus of trying to change history while not focusing on who are the bad guys today, I mean, that is what's really mind-boggling, right? Oh, well, you mentioned this in your book, even China, right? We talk about China. So the U.S. is blamed for what is the opium, right? Like people are still talking about opium in China. Meanwhile, China is funneling fentanyl into the United States today.
Yes, it's a fantastic way to, I mean, history is endlessly important to know about, but the present is also important to know about. And yes, there is an opioid war going on at the moment, mainly with synthetic opioids created in China, although now the Mexican cartels know how to make it themselves. I did a documentary earlier this year on the fentanyl crisis in the US. This is a massive, massive crisis. And one, by the way, which again, outside of America, most America and Canada, most Western societies do not have. You do not actually walk, there are many problems in Paris and London and elsewhere, but you do not walk down the streets of major cities and see open drug markets with people just dying on the streets like you can see in Philadelphia and other major American cities. So that should be something which people focus on. And I do think that part of the reason we don't solve some of the problems that are going on in our day, including massive problems like that, I do think one reason is that people can't put their finger on it, or think they shouldn't, or are distracted by this litigation of a long ago problem. So yes, it can be a distraction.
Well, then people are also distracted by issues that are so fringe and non-issues, like these new causes of the transgender movement. Or I'm sure you watched the opening for the Olympic ceremony, which, by the way, speaking of Venn diagrams, is probably the only place where the Ayatollah and I agree, because he tweeted the hashtag was it I'm with Jesus Christ or something like that, and he was upset about
the portrayal of the Last Supper.
portrayal of the Last Supper, and apologized for Christians, or stood up for Christians, which is pretty surprising given that it's the Ayatollah and all Christians are infidels in his mind. But with that said, it is mind-boggling how obsessed the West has been with this particular issue.
That's because I think the West is also in an age of polytheism. I had a great friend who died a few years ago called Deepak Lal, who was a great Indian-born economist and taught at UCLA. And I remember Deepak said to me years ago, "Oh, Douglas, people thought the age of faith in the West would be followed by an age of atheism. It isn't. It's an age of polytheism. You have your gods, I have mine." And of course, the real polytheism of our time is sort of predictable. And now it has landed on this idea that, the bearded, balls out drag queen is the sort of ultimate Gaia-like figure. I mean, you there's that statue on Wall Street that does the same thing. But all of this, again, talking about history, all of this has happened before. The worship of cult figures, the worship of weird gods, hermaphroditic gods. Very, very interesting, that. Do you remember that ad for, was it Apple, I think, a few years ago, where the whole board is sitting there, about a 3 or 4 minute video, the whole board is sitting there and they're visited by this large black woman who turns out to be Mother Earth or Gaia. And she tells them that she's displeased with them and so on. This is something that, if we had the technology, our ancestors did in the, the legend of the Green Man in the first millennia, after Christ, and other weird cult gods. It's astonishing to see this happen in the age of social media. But yes, I mean, the Olympic opening ceremony tableau was, I mean, I'm just profoundly bored by all that stuff because, as I've said a number of times, I just will not go at that speed. And I'm not interested in going at the intellectual speed of people who can't tell the difference between a man and a woman. It's like, I'm not interested in going at the speed of people who don't believe in gravity, not interested in going at the speed of people who come up with these weird conspiracy theories and much more. I'm just not interested in going at that speed. It's going at the speed of the slowest kids in the class. And I'm bored by them. I want them out of the way. I want to spend no more of my life thinking about them. If you want to worship the great bearded drag queen, giver of life, weird green god, like, okay, you to your gods, me to mine.
Well, we're supposed to be able to do that. We're supposed to be, okay, well, these people are freaks. Let them do their thing. Goodbye. But
except it's always shoved down our throats.
Exactly. Everywhere we go, we try to start a new thing and they just, show up, whether it's through DEI initiatives or calling us all kinds of names if you don't bring them in. And, I don't know if you know this about me, but I'm an educator. And so I used to run a school. And so you talk about really catering to the lowest denominator of the class. That is always a bad thing because everybody loses. The kids in the middle and the kids at the top always lose if you're constantly focusing on the lowest common denominator. And that is what much of American schools have done. They have lowered the standards in classrooms in order for everybody to feel good and for the teacher, by the way, to feel good too.
Yes.
Right? Imagine if you were running a company and you get to just lower the standards in order for you to meet these standards, right? That is what we have done here. And our society has been doing the same thing. We've lowered all standards in order to really cater to the freaks.
Well, I think as Mike Pompeo said a couple of years ago, the most dangerous person in America is Randy Weingarten.
Yes.
I think it's absolutely true.
Yes. And Becky Pringle.
I say this as a great lover of America, but the education system in this country is shocking. And it's not to do with money. It's not to do with a lack of resources. If in New York State, for instance, almost $30,000 is allocated per pupil per year for their education, that's a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah, it's not money, it's monsters. It's the other end.
Exactly. I mean, it is, and it's just shocking. The unions, it's all Randy Weingarten. It's always the union. Randy Weingarten, when she's not just talking about foreign policy and going to Ukraine because she's really useful there, and these people just have not done their job. They have so woefully underperformed. And when you have the levels of illiteracy and the numeracy in a society like this, it's shocking. The world's number one economy and superpower should be able to make sure that it's not like in a lot of areas, 50% of K through 12 students just don't have basic literacy or numeracy.
Yeah.
What are we going to do in this century if we keep on? And it's so cruel to the kids.
It's terrible.
It's so cruel. You cannot have a life of the meaning you deserve if you're just incompetent at the basic things.
You want to hear something shocking? So in 2022, I pulled up the NEA's agenda. NEA is the other teachers union in the United States. They have over 2 million members, right? That's Becky Pringle. Guess what their number one issue of business was on their agenda? 2022.
I'm trying to think, probably DEI, race, could be that everyone's got to be trans. I don't know. What was it?
Well, you would hope it would be literacy or math, right? Their number one issue of business was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Protecting the Palestinian indigenous people of that homeland.
Yes.
And so when people are wondering why are students rioting pro-Palestine on college campuses across the United States right now, they've been groomed to do that for years through these political enterprises like the NEA that have been shoving their political ideology into the schools.
And it's so preposterous because, I mean, on that one, if they got their way presumably being the Palestinians get given a state in what is now Israel, what do you get from it? All you get is another failed Arab country, which at best would be incredibly corrupt and violent, and at worst, most likely, would just be another Iranian satellite state. So, why should a teaching union in the US be pushing kids to campaign for something which wouldn't improve the life of anyone, let alone their life in the United States? You want another failed Arab state? Okay, great. What's that going to do for you?
Right. Well, that's why, when you talk about the war on the West and the influence that these other entities outside of the West have on our school systems, people know about the universities, but that impact really goes in deeper. It starts in kindergarten, right? Yeah. And I'm curious, why are you so interested in Israel? Because you're from the UK. You're obviously not Jewish. Why Israel?
Well, lots of reasons. I mean, one is that I've covered a lot of conflicts there and have seen the horrible misrepresentation the country has suffered, always suffers, particularly in wartime. Jews are enormously outnumbered worldwide. There are not many Jews in the world, 16 million, something like that. And they're vastly outnumbered. And so misrepresentation of them, particularly misrepresentation of the one Jewish state in the world, is rampant. And I think it's important, anyone who's concerned about truth and the facts on the ground, should understand the situation properly. There are lots of reasons. Part of it is a gut reason, and part of it is a very straightforward one, which I wish more people understood, which is that there is just a line that is completely clear between the teaching union who pushes, the Palestinian issue. There is a completely clear line between those people and their attitude towards America. It's all on the same continuum. If you hate Israel, guaranteed you at least really dislike America. You really dislike Britain. And by the way, I mean, this is proven all the time. I was at the Prime Minister Netanyahu's address to the joint sessions of Congress the other day, and he made a point. I said this in my New York Post column. He made a very important point from the podium that the people who, he said, our enemies are your enemies. Our fight is your fight, and our victory will be your victory. And as he said, the people who hate Israel are also the people who burn the American flag. Now, he made the point very well inside the Congress. Outside the building, his point was made much better by the protesters protesting him speaking, who scrawled "Abolish the USA" across the Liberty Bell, who put in huge red letters on the Columbus Monument, because of course Columbus is one of their great enemies as well, because they wish that he hadn't found the Americas. It would be much better historically if Columbus had never stumbled upon America. I'm sure you agree. Or that he went back and said to the King of Spain, nothing to see there. But they scrawled all over the Columbus Monument, Hamas is coming. And what did these protesters do in Washington, D.C. the other day? But tore down the American flag outside Union Station, burnt it on the streets of the Capitol, hoisted up the Palestinian flag. And the Speaker of the House and Representative Dan Crenshaw and some other veterans went at the end of business and they re-raised the American flag. But just think about that from the way in which the protesters proved the point. But it's absolutely the case. Every anti-Israel protest in my country of birth, every anti-Israel protest, there's not one Union Jack. It's not like the Palestinian flag and the Hamas flag and the Hezbollah flag and the occasional Union Jack. Never a Union Jack in sight. And when they're calling for jihad or, from the river to the sea and this sort of thing, they never end the day by singing God Save the King. When there's a pro-Israel protest, which there have been a few of, they always finish with Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem, and God Save the King. I noticed that when there's a pro-Israel protest in America, pro-Israel demonstration or rally, people will sing, again, sometimes Hatikva, and they'll sing Star Spangled Banner. And that's just not the case on the other side. These anti-Israel protesters, the reason they do not sing the American national anthem or wave the American flag, they don't like those things. They don't like this country. And it's just Israel first in their line of sights. Of course, it's America as the main one, as your friend the Ayatollah.
He loves me very much.
Says all the time, Israel is the little Satan, but America is the big Satan. And it's America that the Iranian Revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran is really after. Israel is in their first line of sight. America is the main one. And I think that more Americans should realize that.
What do you think America should do?
In the Middle East?
Yes.
I think they should allow Israel to win and not to be stuck in the cycle of endless wars. And the cycle of endless wars, in my view, comes about because of Israel being made to fight to a draw every time. There was an opportunity, I've spoken to one of the commanders who was in charge of it, there was an opportunity in 2010 to destroy Hamas back then. Israel was pulled back from doing so by the international community, international pressure. Well, lots of reasons. I think if there were two main ones I could put my finger on, is one, the two-state delusion, which is the idea that it's in Israel's gift to create a Palestinian state, and that everything about the facts on the ground must be pushed towards a two-state solution. And that if, and again, there have been Democrats and Republicans, conservative and Labor, people from right and left for decades now have had this delusion that they should focus their foreign policy on the two-state solution, because the two-state solution will solve all of the other problems in the Middle East. And that's flat out wrong. There is no reason to suspect that the economy of the Yemen would boom if Mahmoud Abbas ran a deeply corrupt another Palestinian state. There is no reason to think that the Ayatollahs in Iran would suddenly grant Iranian women equal rights and not imprison them if they don't cover their hair, simply because Hamas was running another state in the Middle East. It's a total delusion. Now, there's a case for saying that the Palestinians should have autonomy in certain areas, and if they can have a peaceable state, which they don't bring up their children to try to annihilate the Jewish state, there's an argument for that. But it is a delusion to think that that should be the principal priority of Western policy in the region, and that if it happened, everything would bloom. But the second reason is because there has been a delusion for certainly since the Obama years, and in Britain since the Blair years, that the principal other thing in the region that is to be a priority is the bringing the Iranian Revolutionary Islamic government in Tehran in from the cold. In other words, that the country that since 1979 has been benighted by this appalling brutal Islamist regime, will one day have a moderate. And we can encourage that and deal with that. And that's why whenever a new leader is elected
in Iran.
They're always called the reforming moderate,
Yeah.
And of course, you scratch even slightly beneath the surface, and the people describe them as a moderate because they only want to kill most of the Jews, that sort of thing. Not all of them. They don't want to annihilate America now. I mean, it's our definition of moderate shifts a lot when it comes to Iran.
The People's Republic.
The People's Republic, which is again one of the reliable ones, like with the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. None of those things apart from North Korea. I think this delusion that has taken hold of the Democrats in America and the Conservatives and Labour Party in Britain, among others, and Macron in France, most French foreign policy thinking, and European policy thinking, in fact, in recent decades, has been focused on this question. I think it's the wrong thing. I think that the regime in Tehran, as long as it's there, will continue with its stated objectives. It will continue to be deeply anti-Western, will continue to try to destabilize the West and our allies, particularly Israel, in the region. As long as they're there, that's their belief. That's what they want. And so the idea of bringing them in from the cold is just a delusion. Instead, we should contain them, definitely try to bankrupt them.
So much of the criticism against Bibi Netanyahu's speech, Prime Minister of Israel's speech in the United States, was that he had come to the U.S. to push us into World War III, to push us into a war that we should not be in, because this is what Israel would want. So you went to the speech. And I know you've been studying this issue for a while. What is your response to that?
I mean, I suppose some people think that. I've seen some commenters say, I mean, it's nonsense. I mean, what he's trying to do is to rally an international coalition against the country that is destabilizing the Middle East, which is Iran, or the regime in Iran. You know, it is Iran that has been funding and arming Hamas. It is Iran that has been funding, arming, and training Hezbollah that has destabilized Lebanon. It is Iran that has been funding, arming, and training the Houthi in Yemen, which, you know, is attacking international shipping lanes, has shot at and hit British naval vessels, among others. Wherever you look in the Middle East, it's Iran that has been destabilizing everything. Now, it doesn't seem to me that Israel should have to keep open all the world's water lanes, among other tasks. But Israel is fighting a war very hot in some places, slightly cooler in others, on 7 fronts at the moment. And I don't think that that is fair. I don't think that Israel should have to do that or do it alone. Of course, the Biden administration has been on and off pretty good with helping to rearm Israel in this conflict. But it seems to me that America should be encouraged, along with other Western powers, to make it very clear to Iran that its regional destabilization should not be allowed to continue. Will America do that? We'll see. But that was what Netanyahu was calling for. And there was plenty of criticism of him within Israel for doing that as well. But that is what he has always seen as the principal issue in the region as well. And with one other thing, which is the principal concern he has always had, and which I've always had, long had, is to ensure that Iran, the Iranian Revolutionary Islamic government, never gets nuclear weapons.
Is it fair to expect the United States, which is on the other side of the world, to get involved in wars in the Middle East?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think a lot of people, particularly on the right, have been reevaluating that. A lot of people on the left have long thought that we shouldn't, or that we should come in on another side.
Right. I mean, it almost feels like things have, I don't know if they flip-flopped or I don't know what, but I agree with you. I'm hearing from many on the right, they call it America first maybe, or an isolationist mentality.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely grown on the right. And to be fair to them, it has grown for some completely understandable reasons. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular did not go well. And after 20 years in Afghanistan, America has very little to show for it. Not nothing, by the way, not nothing. The aim was to stop another 9/11 happening, and that worked. And that's a lot. That's a lot to be able to make sure that there were not Al-Qaeda camps in which people are planning to fly planes into major American cities. It's always hard to get any credit for the things that didn't happen. But America does, and brave men and women of the American Armed Forces do deserve an enormous amount of credit for that. But nevertheless, Afghanistan, as people will have noticed, is not a thriving democratic society, and is handed back into the hands of the Taliban.
Yeah, we certainly left in a bad way.
Left in a terrible way. And so when people see that, I understand why a lot of people on the right and the left say, we just don't seem to be very good at this, so let's not do more of it. But I would say that those people who do take the view that therefore America should step back from the world should consider 2 things. Firstly, that, for instance, in the case of Israel, and also, by the way, in the case of Ukraine, people are not asking for American boots on the ground. In both cases, they're asking for American support to allow them to fight the war that they're having to fight. In the case of Ukraine, against Vladimir Putin's aggression. In the case of Israel, against Iranian aggression. And that is a very different thing. Nobody, as far as I know, nobody high up or in a position of influence in Israel or in America is saying we should have GIs in the Middle East. Quite other than that. The Israelis are capable, have shown themselves very capable of fighting to defend their country and their families and their people. And they're asking for American support in the form of armaments, diplomatic support, deterrence effects like planes being sent to the region to patrol and just show as a sign of strength. A very good thing, I think, that early in the conflict, President Biden sent a aircraft carrier to the region. But they're asking for that. That's a very different thing. But the second thing I would say, and do say to the sort of America first, because of course, by the way, the America first thing is, of course, America should be first for Americans.
But is it also America only?
Right. Now, and the thing I say to those people is, there is a massive contradiction they have in their thinking, which they should at some point address. The America-only people that I have spoken to and know don't want America in the 21st century to be an obscure power. They don't want China, the Chinese Communist Party, to be the premier country in the world. In fact, if you say that to them, they're horrified by the idea. So I would say that the thing they have to address is, you do still want to be the premier power in the world, don't you? Yes. But you think you can do it by withdrawing from the world entirely? You think that's possible? You think that if America is not interested in the world, other countries are not? I mean, America isn't very interested in Africa, but the Chinese Communist Party is really interested in Africa and is doing very clever things, not just in Belt and Road, but buying up of mineral resources and much more. So, again, with the Middle East, with the Near East, if America is not interested, at least, I'm afraid there are other countries that are. And I think that the America-only people should really make up their minds on this. America can either be a secondary or tertiary world power, or it can be the premier world power. And if it's premier world power, it should keep an interest in the world. That is not to say it should intervene everywhere. Far from it. It does not mean that it should be the sole policeman in the world, because this is a horrible and onerous job, and it is preposterous that, for instance, America should be, holding too much, carrying too much of the water for global security. Of course, NATO allies need to step up, have to step up, and some have. But that needs American leadership in the world. It does not mean that America should be the fool in this. Of course not. But it cannot just step back. That's a delusion. It's a dream. It's one that throughout American history has tempted people.
Yeah.
But it's a temptation like a lot of temptations that should be resisted.
Can I share with you some of the criticism that people who are watching right now might have about what you said? The things I hear them say is that America is funding both sides of the war. There is a military-industrial complex that is profiting from World War, where they essentially encourage war. The U.S. encourages war, encourages a war in Israel so that Israel will then go and buy more armament. Just curious about what is your response to the criticism of this, I guess, military-industrial war complex?
You do hear this. By the way, this used to be an argument made only on the political left.
Yes.
And it has now been picked up by parts of the right. It used to be a sort of Chomskyite argument on the left that, the reason why the world was unstable was principally because of the military-industrial complex and people who wanted to get rich from war.
Yes.
I mean, look, some people can get rich from war, I suppose, but the idea that it's the principal purpose of war is, I think so deeply cynical as well as provably untrue. And by the way, in our societies in America and elsewhere, there are places where we put respect. People often think there aren't areas of our societies where respect is given, but actually there are. Like, people respect nurses, people respect doctors, people used to respect medical health professionals have taken a bit of a hit, and so on. But it's not like our societies respect enormously arms companies. It's not one of the main. Arms production is a sad necessity, but every country has an arms industry of some kind, because private industry often gets outsourced by governments to produce basic things like shells and munitions. But the idea that anyone, let alone this sort of shadowy cabal, is engineering conflict for that purpose is not just something I think has never been proved. I just think it's a deeply cynical attitude towards things, and also just a very simplistic omni-explanation for a lot of complex realities. I don't think the Ayatollahs in Iran are being led by the nose by the military-industrial complex in America.
Really? We can't blame the West for that too?
Well, that again, it falls to that temptation to think it must be something we're doing, must be something in our society.
Yes, it's an amazing thing when you put it that way, because on the one hand, we think that so many elements of our government are so incompetent, right? Because like the bigger the government, the smaller the citizen. They're just, anything you give to them, they break, right? The simplest example is just shipping, like, UPS, which is private, versus government operated mail.
Yeah.
Terrible, right? And you can take larger examples, the education system, et cetera. And so on the one hand, they're so incompetent. On the other hand, they are so competent that they can create this entire narrative that will suck the entire world into different wars, and in order to enrich themselves. It's like, which one is it?
Well, this is another I think, expression of what I describe as that second dark age problem, which is there's so much going on, so much information coming at us, that the unifying explanation is especially attractive. I think that's why our era has slipped into conspiracy theory on the right and the left. By the way, also I should say with conspiracy theory, one of the annoying things about this is that some conspiracies turn out to be true, or things are described as conspiracy theories that are happening. A lot of Western governments describe the idea that mass migration is occurring and is destabilizing our societies. They describe that as a conspiracy theory. No, that's just happening. Are there conspiracy theories that come from that? Oh, you bet. But they're in part exacerbated by governments pretending that what is happening in front of our eyes is not happening. But I do think that in this era of enormous complexity, and just, as I say, the main thing is just this stuff washing over us all the time. I think that looking for overarching explanations, trying to work out a figure in the haze is very attractive, because it's something you can hold on to.
Well, it's what people have always done. They kind of want to put their finger on something or point their finger at someone in order to blame them for horrific things that happen, including greed and murder and crime and all of that. I mean, as a child of a Jewish family, I learned about these conspiracy theories, and when I hear about them, I feel like they always somehow land with Jew hatred, right?
Yeah,
so
for sure.
you look at the conspiracy theories in Russia, right, where they were blaming the Jews, right? Tsarist Russia, where they were blaming the Jews for the bubonic plague. Well, why weren't the Jews dying from the bubonic plague at the same rates as the rest of the Russians? And they didn't look at it as, well, the Jews had washing rituals and they were kind of more insular and they had their own wells, and so things were clean. And so it wasn't that the Jews were infecting the rest of the Russians with a disease in order to kill them, but the Jews were blamed for that. And then you take that into Nazi Germany, right? Where, Germany suffered tremendously with economic defeat, as well as, the defeat after the war. Well, who did they blame? They blamed the Jews. They had to point their finger, and it started with conspiracy theories. There must be somebody behind this economic situation that everybody is suffering with.
Yes.
And so it is so hard for me to not have a visceral response to conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories seem to always blame the Jews.
Yes, yeah. Well, the Jews are pretty much perfect as a receiver of these conspiracies. I mean, it's sort of perfect because it's a distinctly small minority of the global population which tends to outperform wherever it is. Now, that's not always been the case, but it's very often been the case historically, and for reasons including some ones you gave. I mean, Jewish participation in banking, for instance. So people, could see something sinister in that. But I mean, it was only for the same reasons that Scots, I can say this as half Scot, were very prominent in banking. And it was to do with trust between communities of trust. The Scots had a particular way of doing it, lending money in the knowledge that you would be able to get it back. Same thing within Jewish communities. It had much more to do with trust than any issue of conspiracy, And of course, lending laws in Europe in past centuries. But yes, the Jews are, because they're a minority, are very, very just terribly, horribly vulnerable to these sorts of claims. And, I believe it's a sort of, in part, also a psychological problem. The late Martin Amis said that he had once spoken to a psychiatrist who claimed he could predict with considerable certainty when one of his patients was about to turn anti-Semitic. Yeah, and it came somewhere after paranoia started to kick in. It makes total sense. I've seen it a few times myself. And I think that generally once you get into paranoid thinking, and again, I'm not dissing all paranoid thinking, because sometimes you're right when you're paranoid. But there is a level of it which you start to want to find people to blame. And the Jews are just very available for that. But in general, that this is a sort of low resolution way to look at really complex problems.
Do you think there is an inoculation against that kind of mind virus of?
Yeah, I think there is to an extent, but you'll never be able to eradicate it.
Sure.
I mean, one of the ways I say that you've made it clear that you don't know anything about anti-Semitism is if you say that we must eradicate it.
Not possible.
Not possible. You can dampen it down. You can try to lead people away from it, but it's so just available as a mind virus. But there are lots of mind viruses going around at the moment, and I think, as I say, they happen on the right, they happen on the left, and they need to be countered. Is that uphill work? You bet. But it's not hopeless.
Mm-hmm. One of your favorite quotes, which you haven't had a chance to say yet, but I absolutely love, is that America is getting fat and lazy and China is getting hungrier than ever. It probably got you into trouble, but it is true. And we have to think about that seriously. What are your thoughts about China right now if America continues to project this weakness?
A lot of political economists, you might say it's inevitable because they're political economists, but we'll say there's one primary role of government, which is to make sure the economy does not go wrong. And I actually, although I think it's sort of to some extent exaggerated, it's not a complete exaggeration, because if the economy goes wrong, everything else goes wrong. And actually in recent years, particularly people coming up, the economy is not working for a lot of people in our countries. It's not impossible, but it is hard in an era of inflation to accumulate capital. It is hard in the post-2008 period of quantitative easing to be able to get enough of a deposit together to put down money for a home. It was never easy to live in major cities. It was never cheap, but it wasn't always this hard. And it's hard for young people at the moment. It's hard for some older people as well. But that thing of getting on property ladder, things like that, that is something that is so important for governments to be able to fix. I think that because governments, broadly speaking, have failed since 2008, and the economy is not working for so many people, and we have the cost of living crisis, and everyone knows your grocery bill is just like, how did that happen?
Overwhelming.
It's just unbelievable. And it's quite a hard thing to explain. I mean, people feel it, but it's quite technical, to explain what inflation actually does. But we all feel it. We all know it. And as long as that is going on, I think that some cynical politicians and others effectively say, let them eat identity politics. I mean, at times like that, if you can't do the things which really are necessary to give your life meaning and to give your life a drive and a purpose and the knowledge that things are going to be better for you next year than they are today, if you don't have that, maybe, you can be persuaded that no one will be free until, everyone who wants to have their dick cut off gets it cut off, which seems to me to be ridiculous.
Right. It's just a distraction.
It's a
just an
horrible
absolute
distraction. Am I allowed to say what I just said?
Yes, you can
okay.
just say it's real talk, right?
Okay. But I mean, to me, it's preposterous that we should sort of say, let's just make sure that no trans child isn't supported. What? What are you talking about? There was not even a phrase for trans child till about 10 years ago. Now you want to spend all your time obsessing about this and doubling down on this? I think it's because these things that are much, much more important are not being addressed by our government or by our economy. And I think that there are so many follow-on problems from that. I said in The Madness of Crowds, it's not obvious to me that a young person who cannot accrue capital will automatically become a capitalist. In fact, it's very likely they will be seduced by other ideas. Why in the post-2008 period did so many people start to say things like, was Marx right? No, he still wasn't right. But it's almost as if, there's capitalism and then Marxism. And if capitalism isn't working, maybe we should look at Marxism again. Completely insane way of looking at things. Marxism still doesn't work, cannot work, never worked anywhere. Never got any society out of poverty, relative or otherwise. Capitalism can work, is the only mechanism we've ever come up with as a society to improve the lot of society. I mean, if you look at the charts of, human, wealth accumulation, now we were just deadlining for millennia. People did, a king in the 16th century in Europe had no way to grow the pie other than trying to squeeze people for more taxes who had no money and were living in what we would now regard as destitution, or invading a country and taking their money. But until capitalism, we had no idea of how to grow the pie. And now we do have an idea. Does it work all the time? No. Could it work better? Definitely. Is the answer, when it's not working optimally, Marxism? No, obviously not. But that's when people can be seduced by bad ideas and go back and look at bad ideas in the past and wonder, maybe we can try that again.
If you're spending your entire day trying to make ends meet, you don't have time to even think about growth or freedom or bigger issues, right? It's just, you'll just get distracted.
But by the way, I should also stress that there is a something in this which does also have to be said, and the sort of boomer criticism does forget the fact that although our parents, I think, say, did live in an era where, you could get a mortgage that was 3 times your salary and, and so on. And now, because of the rocketing of house prices and so on, it's like you need like 10 times your salary. And so there are things like that. But still, it was not easy for our parents' generation. And I think that one of the things which it's very hard for politicians to say, particularly in America, is there are some things in the system, the economic system, that are not working as well as we would like them to work, and that the cost of living crisis and your grocery bill are some of them. But don't sit back and think it's going to be solved for you. Like, don't do that. You should work your what off. And if you do, you can be rewarded for it. And I think of all the families in America where a mom or a father, holds down a couple of jobs, and it's still not easy, but they're not behaving as if they're owed everything. And I do think that one of the remarkable things that has driven the American economy always is simply the American public and the American worker. it is so important that they feel that they have a stake in it and that they can get better, and that their lives next year will be better than this year, and their lives 10 years from now will be better than it is now. And that, the guy driving that car, maybe I can drive that car one day. And that's a brilliant thing that inspires and fuels the American economy. But we should not bring up a fatalistic generation who are like, capitalism isn't working for me, so I'll wait till something does. No. You have to go and make your own luck on some of that.
Final question. You wrote a book about the strange death of Europe. You're now here in the United States watching the woke mind virus wash through the entire country. Are you more optimistic about the US than Europe? Do you think that we have a similar fate?
I think Europe and Britain are in a real, there's a real spiral they could be in at the moment. And it's happening in Britain at the moment where, unfettered immigration, mass immigration, illegal migration, and legal migration have been at historic highs. And societies that were high trust societies have become very low trust societies. And societies that were very coherent, including in my own life, have become or are becoming really wildly incoherent societies, where there's very little, increasingly little, that's binding them together. And I'd say it's the same in France and across continental Europe. It's very, very worrying and very dangerous. And we have seen recently with things like the atrocity of this terrible young man who went and stabbed these young girls who were the Taylor Swift dance class.
The little girls.
Just beyond belief. And the public mood is febrile. And there have been demonstrations and even things that, we do not see often in Britain, burning of police stations by very angry mobs. And then I just see today, a Muslim group, sort of doing a boundary policing thing in their area of chanting Allahu Akbar and defend the mosque sort of thing. The way in which things can go wrong, and it's exactly tell you, worst thing for me is it's exactly what I said would happen. And the reason I wrote The Strange Death of Europe, and the reason I banged on about this for years beforehand, was I said it is so obvious what is going to happen.
Yeah.
And it gives me, I'm so angry watching it when it could have been stopped.
Yeah, it sucks to be right about something so bad.
I wanted to be wrong. However, there is a deep distrust among the political class in the UK about the British public. They really don't seem to like them. They're so eager to attack the general public and cover over for anything else. And I think it's just a lamentable and suicidal policy. And I think it's one that happens across Europe. The saving grace in America, and I don't see that still can't be turned around. It could be with the right leadership. The saving grace in America is some kind of belief in the goodness of the American people. And that's taken a beating. My goodness, the education system has done everything it can to bash the innate goodness out of the American people. But I believe that the optimism, the belief in the family, the belief in the family unit, and therefore all of those communities that follow out from it, I still think there's a sort of goodness about that, a faith in that, a hope in that, that when you extrapolate it out to the widest form of that, the nation, the public, still has a certain belief about it, and that you can still ignite that American optimism. Despite all of the efforts that have been made, it's not been completely beaten out of the American public. And I think there is a feeling that despite, the things happening from right and left and all of the fears and confusion we're all living through, I do still think there is this thing that America is good and has been a force for good in the world and can be again. And that hope, what we call the American dream, is not dead, has not been beaten out of people completely, and still should give us hope and give us the possibility that the 21st century will not be this dark age, but could be one in which America and its allies, hopefully, could show a positive vision of what to do in the world. If that happens, the future really is ours. If it doesn't happen, the future belongs to goodness knows who. And if people, as I always say, if people think the era of American dominance was awful and, oppressive, you wouldn't like any of the rivals.
Well, boy, am I glad that at least you ended this with something positive, because I do believe that Americans have it in our DNA to want freedom and self-reliance. It's kind of what we're made of over here. And as much as our education system, which is number 34 in the world, is failing, or maybe it's succeeding in what it's set to do, sadly, I think many of us know that, and we're seeing it, and we're ready to fight for it. And it's no surprise that fighters like you come to the United States to spread this message to the rest of the world. And so it's a great way to end this interview. And as always, Douglas, you're brilliant. It was really great talking to you.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.